1497. The port of Lisbon. The air itself is a thick, suffocating blanket woven from contradictory sensations. There is the sharp, clean smell of salt on the Atlantic wind, a promise of vast, open spaces. But it is choked by the stench of humanity packed too tightly, the sour odor of fear sweating from thousands of pores, the cloying smoke of pitch-caulked hulls, and the gut-wrenching miasma of the city's open drains. The sounds are a torment, a symphony of orchestrated chaos. In the foreground, the rhythmic clang of hammers on anvils, the shouts of foremen, the creak and groan of immense timbers as supplies are winched aboard 3 small, sturdy ships, the São Gabriel, the São Rafael, and the Berrio. This is the sound of a great enterprise beginning, a nation's destiny being forged in wood and iron. But beneath it, a more terrible sound, a human counterpoint of agony. It is the weeping of families being torn apart on the docks, the desperate prayers of rabbis in makeshift synagogues, the heart-wrenching screams of children being forcibly separated from their parents, dragged toward baptismal fonts by grim-faced priests and brutal soldiers. This is the sound of a nation's soul being torn out. On the decks of his flagship, Vasco da Gama can see the light glinting off the steel helmets of the king's guards, a hard, unforgiving shimmer. He feels the thrum of the new ship beneath his feet, a living thing eager to challenge the ocean. He is a man on the cusp of immortality, chosen to complete a quest a century in the making. Yet even he cannot ignore the human tide of misery flooding the port, the price of his voyage. For this entire spectacle, this grand departure into the unknown, and this brutal purification of the kingdom is a single, indivisible act. It is a wedding gift. It is King Manuel's dowry payment to the Catholic monarchs of Spain for the hand of their daughter, Isabella. One man's love, or rather his ambition disguised as love, is launching these ships into the abyss and, at the very same moment, plunging 250,000 of his own subjects into a living hell. The world is being remade today, right here in the filth and glory of the Lisbon docks, and it is being done not for God, not for gold, but for the promise of a royal marriage bed. This is the narrative of him, Manuel I of Portugal, the man history would call the Fortunate. This was the saga of a king who, against all probability, inherited a throne he was never meant to occupy, and who in his reign would preside over one of the most explosive expansions of human knowledge and power ever witnessed. He was the monarch who unlocked the sea route to India, who laid the foundations of the first global empire, and who turned his small, windswept kingdom on the edge of Europe into the richest nation on earth. But his story is not a simple tale of glorious exploration and heroic discovery. It is a dark and twisted epic, a story steeped in a paradox so profound it beggars belief. To understand this man, we must ask the core question that his reign forces upon us. How? How did one man's deeply personal, almost pathologically intense obsession to win the hand of a single woman, the Spanish Infanta Isabella of Aragon, become the direct and undeniable catalyst for shattering the medieval map of the world? How did a dynastic love story, a political maneuver for a crown he coveted, force him to make a series of brutal, fateful decisions that would unleash the forces of globalization, colonialism, and a new age of empire upon an unsuspecting planet? We must strip away the gilded myths of the Age of Discovery, the heroic statues and the epic poems, and look into the cold, calculating heart of the matter. The entire grand enterprise, the financing of Vasco da Gama, the rounding of Africa, the blasting open of the Indian Ocean trade routes, was all, at its core, a consequence of a marriage negotiation. The world was not changed by a grand vision of exploration, but by the bitter terms of a wedding contract. This is the story of how a king's desire to unite two thrones on a small peninsula in Europe ended up cleaving the entire globe in two. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the late 15th century, a world teetering on the precipice of monumental change. It is a geopolitical chessboard alive with tension, a moment of profound endings and violent beginnings. In the East, the great behemoth of the Ottoman Empire, having conquered Constantinople in 1453, now sits astride the ancient trade routes. The Sultan in Istanbul holds the windpipe of Europe in his hand, controlling the flow of spices, silks, and wealth from the Orient. The Old World Order, the one dominated by the merchant republics of Venice and Genoa who grew fat as middlemen, is slowly strangling. They are the gatekeepers, and the price of their pepper is becoming unbearable. In the heart of Europe, the embers of the 100 Years' War are still cooling, leaving France and England exhausted but newly consolidated into powerful nation-states. In Italy, the city-states are ablaze with the creative fires of the High Renaissance, but their political squabbles leave them vulnerable, a prize to be fought over by larger powers. And on the Iberian Peninsula, the board has been violently transformed. In 1492, a year of miracles and horrors, the joint Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, completed the centuries-long reconquista by capturing the last Muslim emirate of Granada. In that same year, they expelled their entire Jewish population, and seeking a new crusade, sent a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus west into the unknown. Spain has become a new, unified, and aggressive power, brimming with crusading zeal and hungry for expansion. And perched on its Atlantic flank is Portugal, a small kingdom with a population of barely over 1 million souls. A long, thin strip of land, its back to a powerful and often hostile Spain, its face to the terrifying emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. For a century, this small nation has been engaged in a slow, methodical, and costly project: the exploration of the African coast, a legacy of the visionary Prince Henry the Navigator. It is a nation of sailors and shipbuilders, a people who know the sea, but they are at a crossroads. Their path south along Africa is slow and perilous. The prize of the spice trade seems impossibly distant, and their mighty neighbor, Spain, has just stumbled upon what it believes is a new world. Portugal is in danger of being left behind, a forgotten backwater. This is the world Manuel is about to inherit. A world of closing doors and tantalizing new possibilities. A world where the old ways are dying and the new ones are being born in blood and fire. The man who would inherit this crucible was not forged to be a king. He was Manuel, Duke of Beja, born in 1469, a ninth child, a spare, a minor footnote in the royal lineage of the House of Aviz. His position was one of immense privilege, but zero prospect of ultimate power. He existed in the shadow of the throne, close enough to feel its warmth, but destined to remain in the cold. To understand his character, one must understand the formative trauma that shaped his youth. His elder brother, Diogo, Duke of Viseu, was a charismatic, ambitious, and reckless man who conspired against the reigning king, his own cousin, John II. In 1484, King John, a ruthless and efficient ruler known as the Perfect Prince, summoned Diogo to a private meeting. There, in a cold stone chamber, the king himself, with his own hands, stabbed his cousin to death. Manuel, then a boy of 15, was now the heir to his murdered brother's titles and lands, but he was also the brother of a man executed for treason by a king who had proven he would not hesitate to kill his own family. This was the lesson that burned itself into Manuel's soul. Ambition is a fatal disease unless it is perfectly concealed. He learned to survive in a court thick with paranoia and fear. He developed a mask of unassuming loyalty, of quiet piety and meticulous patience. He became an expert at watching, at listening, at waiting. While other nobles postured and plotted, Manuel cultivated his estates, managed his finances, and made himself appear utterly harmless, a man content with his secondary role. But beneath this placid exterior, the murder of his brother had forged a core of ice-cold resolve. He understood that power was a zero-sum game, that proximity to the throne was the most dangerous place on earth, and that his own survival depended on a level of self-control and cunning that bordered on the inhuman. He was not destined to rule, so he would not grasp for power. He would let power come to him, making himself the only viable, stable, and safe option in a dangerous world. This was the genesis of the man who would be called the Fortunate, a man whose supposed luck was, in reality, a masterpiece of calculated survival. The stage for Manuel's ascent was set not by conspiracy or warfare, but by cruel fate and the thunder of horses' hooves. The year was 1491. King John II, the man who had murdered Manuel's brother, had a single beloved son and heir, Prince Afonso. Afonso was the bright future of the dynasty, recently married to Isabella of Aragon, the eldest daughter of the Spanish monarchs, a union designed to seal peace and a potential future unification of the Iberian kingdoms. Then, one hot summer's day, while riding by the banks of the river Tagus, Prince Afonso's horse stumbled. The prince was thrown, his skull crushed in the fall. He was dead within hours. The king was shattered, the queen inconsolable, and the kingdom was plunged into a succession crisis. With his only legitimate son gone, King John, whose health was already failing, had to look for an heir amongst his cousins. His first instinct was to legitimize his illegitimate son, Jorge de Lencastre. But this move was fiercely opposed by the nobility and, crucially, by his own wife, Queen Leonor, who was Manuel's sister. They saw in Jorge a continuation of John's authoritarian style. They looked for an alternative, and their eyes fell upon the quiet, unassuming Duke of Beja. Manuel played his part to perfection. He did not lobby, he did not conspire, he did not make grand promises. He simply existed, the perfect contrast to both the illegitimate Jorge and the memory of his own treacherous brother. He was the safe candidate. He attended the king, showed perfect deference, and allowed his powerful sister, the queen, to advocate on his behalf. The court became a nest of intrigue, with factions coalescing around the two potential heirs. King John fought desperately for his bastard son's cause, even appealing to the Pope. But his health was fading, and the opposition, expertly orchestrated by the Queen and her allies, held firm. When King John II finally succumbed to his illness in 1495, he had no choice. On his deathbed, he named Manuel, the brother of the man he had personally killed, as his successor. Manuel had played the long game and won. He had outlived his rivals, outweighted his king, and ascended to the throne not through the sword, but through tragedy and his own masterful inaction. He was now King Manuel I, and he had inherited a kingdom on the brink of greatness, a task for which he had been secretly preparing his entire life. Once on the throne, the quiet, patient mask of the Duke of Beja fell away to reveal the true face of King Manuel I, and at the core of his being, driving every political calculation and every strategic decision was a secret, all-consuming motivation. It was not simply a desire for wealth, nor was it a simple continuation of Portugal's century-long quest for exploration. It was a grandiose, messianic, and deeply personal obsession that can only be called the Iberian Dream. Manuel did not see himself as merely the King of Portugal. He saw himself as a man chosen by God, a new Constantine destined to unite the entire Iberian Peninsula under his rule. He looked at the joint crowns of Castile and Aragon, held by Ferdinand and Isabella, and saw not an ally, but a prize. His ultimate goal was to become the king of a unified Spain and Portugal, the undisputed emperor of a new Western Christendom. This was not just geopolitics, it was eschatology. He believed this unified Iberian empire would be the sword of God in the final days, the force that would outflank the Ottoman Empire, crush Islam, and sail up the Red Sea to liberate Jerusalem, ushering in the Second Coming. It was a staggering ambition, a fantasy of apocalyptic proportions. And this vast, world-spanning vision, this inner demon of divine destiny, became entirely focused and personified in one individual, Isabella of Aragon. She was the eldest daughter of the Catholic monarchs, the widow of the unfortunate Prince Afonso. By marrying her, Manuel would not just gain a wife, he would place himself first in line to inherit the entirety of Spain. Their future son would be the heir to a united kingdom stretching from the Atlantic to the Pyrenees. Every other policy objective, the voyages to India, the wars in Morocco, the reform of the laws, was secondary to this one, magnificent obsession. Isabella was not a woman to him. She was a symbol, the living embodiment of his divine right to rule all of Hispania. This secret motivation explains the almost reckless energy of his reign. He was not building an empire for Portugal. He was building a war chest and a global platform to support his claim to a much greater throne. He had to prove himself worthy, to show his powerful in-laws and the world that he, Manuel of the minor house of Aviz, was a monarch of world historical importance, God's chosen instrument for the final act of human history. The pursuit of this Iberian dream led directly to the most fateful encounter of Manuel's reign, the cold, hard-nosed negotiations with his prospective parents-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. These were not sentimental rulers. They were the pragmatic and often brutal architects of the new Spanish state. Ferdinand was a master of cynical diplomacy, a man who saw Europe as a chessboard where dynasties were the key pieces. Isabella was a woman of fierce, unbending piety, who saw her reign as a holy crusade. They held the key to Manuel's ambition, their daughter, the widowed Isabella, and they knew her value. When Manuel sent his emissaries to propose the marriage, he was met not with warm acceptance, but with a calculated, unyielding demand. The Catholic monarchs presented a condition that was designed as much to test Manuel's resolve as it was to further their own religious agenda. In 1492, they had given their own Jewish population a stark choice: convert to Christianity or be expelled from the kingdom. It was an act of brutal religious purification that had sent shockwaves across Europe. Now they demanded the same of Manuel: the price for their daughter's hand, the price for the potential unification of Iberia, was that Portugal must be cleansed of its heretics. He must expel or forcibly convert his entire Jewish population. This was a catastrophic demand. For centuries, Portugal had been a relative haven for Jews, and they formed a vital part of the kingdom's economic and intellectual life. They were the bankers who financed the costly overseas expeditions, the cartographers who drew the secret maps, the astronomers who perfected the navigational techniques, the doctors and merchants who drove the urban economy. To expel them would be to lobotomize the kingdom, to cut out the very brain that had conceived of the great enterprise of discovery. Manuel was faced with a terrible choice: abandon his dynastic, messianic dream of uniting Iberia, or sacrifice a cornerstone of his nation's prosperity and soul. The encounter was not a negotiation between equals. It was a test of faith and ambition. Ferdinand and Isabella were forcing Manuel to prove that he was one of them, a true Catholic monarch willing to place religious purity above worldly concerns. For Manuel, the choice was agonizing, but in the end, it was no choice at all. The Iberian dream was everything: the prize of Isabella's hand and the crown of Spain that came with it was worth any price. He agreed to their terms. This fateful decision, born of a negotiation for a woman's hand, would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only Portugal, but the world itself. The first payment for Manuel's dream was rendered in the currency of human suffering, a spectacle of organized cruelty that unfolded in the streets of Lisbon in 1496. Following his agreement with the Spanish monarchs, Manuel issued his edict of expulsion. But unlike the Spanish, Manuel had no intention of allowing the brilliant minds and vast capital of his Jewish subjects to leave the country. He was not a religious fanatic like Isabella of Castile. He was a pragmatist. He wanted their assets and their skills, but he needed to present a pure kingdom to his future bride. His solution was a masterpiece of cynical brutality. He initially promised ships to carry the Jews who wished to leave into exile. But when some 20,000 men, women, and children gathered in Lisbon, believing they were to be given safe passage, the trap was sprung. The king declared them all to be his slaves, arguing that as they were on his land after the deadline, they had forfeited their freedom. They were then dragged, screaming and protesting, to the baptismal fonts. The sensory assault on the city was absolute. The air, thick with the smoke from burning religious texts, was filled with the sounds of wailing, of Hebrew prayers turning into cries of despair. Priests backed by armed soldiers sprinkled holy water on entire crowds of people at once, declaring them new Christians against their will. Children were physically torn from the arms of their parents to be raised in Christian households, a psychological torture designed to break the will of the community. It was not a conversion, it was a mass abduction of souls, a state-sponsored pogrom disguised as a sacrament. Manuel in his palace remained coldly resolute. He understood the horror of what he was doing, but he saw it as a necessary political act, a surgical amputation to save the body of his grand ambition. He was sacrificing a vital organ of his kingdom, its financial and intellectual heart, on the altar of his dynastic marriage. This act of violence had immediate and profound consequences. It created a deep wound in Portuguese society, a legacy of suspicion and religious persecution that would fester for centuries in the form of the Inquisition. But more immediately, by crippling his traditional sources of finance, Manuel made the success of the overseas ventures not just desirable, but absolutely essential. The sea route to India was no longer just a potential source of profit. It was now the only hope for refinancing a kingdom he had intentionally bankrupted for the sake of a wedding. The pressure on Vasco da Gama, preparing to sail, was now immense. He was no longer just an explorer. He was the king's last, desperate gamble. Every great hero requires a great antagonist, and for Manuel, the enemy was not a single man or a rival kingdom, but a vast, ancient, and immensely powerful system, the Venetian Mamluk monopoly. This was the commercial leviathan that had dominated world trade for centuries. To understand the scale of Manuel's ambition, one must understand the sheer power of this adversary. For generations, the flow of spices from the Indies, the pepper from the Malabar coast, the cloves from the Moluccas, the cinnamon from Ceylon, traveled a tortuous, fragmented path to the kitchens of Europe. It was a journey through 1,000 hands, with each hand taking its share. The spices were grown on distant islands, gathered by local merchants, shipped by Arab dhows across the Indian Ocean to ports in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. From there, they were carried by camel caravans across the deserts of Egypt and Arabia to great emporiums like Alexandria or Beirut. At these Mediterranean ports, the merchants of the Venetian Republic were waiting. They held an exclusive ironclad contract with the Mamluk sultans of Egypt. They were the sole European distributors. They bought the spices, loaded them onto their galleys, and sailed them back to the Rialto in Venice, where they were sold to the rest of Europe at an astronomical markup. The price of a peppercorn could increase by a factor of 1,000 or more between the docks of Calicut and a marketplace in Lisbon. This system was the source of the legendary wealth of Venice, the reason for its marble palaces and its powerful navy. It was also the financial engine of the Mamluk Sultanate, which used the tax revenues to fund its armies. This was the great wall that stood between Europe and the riches of the East. It was a faceless, diffuse, and deeply entrenched enemy, a web of contracts, traditions, and armed interests stretching halfway across the globe. For Manuel, breaking this monopoly was the central economic objective of his reign. It was not merely about getting cheaper pepper. It was a revolutionary act of economic warfare. If his ships could sail directly to the source, around Africa, he could cut out every single middleman: the Arab dhows, the camel caravans, the Mamluk tax collectors, and the Venetian galleys. He could redirect the entire river of wealth from the canals of Venice to the banks of the Tagus. This was the colossal prize that awaited Vasco da Gama at the end of his voyage. To succeed was to not only make Portugal the richest state in Europe, but to simultaneously bankrupt its greatest commercial rival and weaken the primary Islamic power that stood as a buffer to the Ottoman Turks. This was the grand strategy, an ambition so audacious that to the Venetians it was simply unthinkable. The strategy was sound, the ambition limitless, but the edifice of Manuel's dream was built upon the fragile foundation of a single human life. In 1497, his bride, Isabella of Aragon, arrived in Portugal. She was a woman of intense, almost morbid piety, who had only agreed to the marriage on the condition of the Jewish expulsion and with the declared aim of uniting Iberia for the glory of God. For a brief, shining moment, Manuel had everything he had ever wanted. The marriage was concluded, and Isabella soon became pregnant. The dream was on the verge of becoming flesh and blood. Their son would be the heir to Portugal, and with the only male heir to the Spanish throne being a sickly infant, he would almost certainly inherit the crowns of Castile and Aragon as well. The title Manuel craved, Emperor of Hispania, was within his grasp. Then, in August of 1498, the dream shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Isabella gave birth to a healthy son, whom they named Miguel de Paz, Michael of the Peace. But the labor was torturous, and the queen died within an hour of giving birth. Manuel's personal apocalypse had arrived. He had sacrificed the soul of his kingdom for this woman, and now she was gone. Yet the dream was not entirely dead. It now rested on the tiny shoulders of the infant Miguel, who was immediately recognized as the heir to Portugal, and, after the death of the Spanish prince, the heir to Castile and Aragon as well. For nearly 2 years, the fate of the entire peninsula lay in the hands of this one child. Manuel governed as a regent in waiting, preparing for the day his son would inherit 3 crowns. But in July of 1500, while in Granada with his Spanish grandparents, the infant prince suddenly fell ill and died. It was over. The entire grand design, the justification for the religious persecution, the years of patient planning, all of it had turned to dust. This was Manuel's great psychological breaking point. He was a man who believed in his own destiny, in his divine favor, in the moniker of the fortunate. The deaths of his wife and son were not just a personal tragedy. They were a theological crisis. It was a sign from God that his methods were wrong, or worse, that he had been abandoned. He understood in that moment of profound grief and failure that fate was not a guarantee. The path he had chosen, a path of ruthless ambition, now demanded even greater, more spectacular acts to prove his worthiness to God and to the world. He had tried to win an empire through the marriage bed, and he had failed. Now he would have to conquer one with the sword and the cannon. Out of the depths of his personal despair, a new hope arrived on the winds from the east. Just as news of his son's death was shattering his world, another, almost unbelievable report was spreading like wildfire through the streets of Lisbon. In the summer of 1499, 2 years after they had departed, the surviving ships of Vasco da Gama's expedition limped back into the Tagus River. They were battered, their hulls trailing seaweed, their crews decimated by scurvy. Of the 170 men who had set out, fewer than 60 had returned, but they brought with them a cargo that would change the world forever. They carried a few precious chests of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, spices so valuable they were worth more than 60 times the entire cost of the expedition. But more importantly, they brought back knowledge. They brought proof. Da Gama had done it. He had sailed around the tip of Africa, crossed the treacherous Indian Ocean, and reached the port of Calicut on the coast of India, the very heart of the spice trade. He had spoken with the rulers of the East and had opened a direct sea lane to the source of Europe's greatest luxuries. For Manuel, this news was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was a sign. God had closed the door to the throne of Spain, but he had opened a window onto the riches of the entire world. It was in this moment of profound crisis, his grief still raw, that Manuel seized upon this opportunity with the ferocious energy of a man reborn. He saw instantly that the return of Da Gama was not just a commercial success. It was the key to his new, reimagined ambition. If he could no longer become the emperor of Hispania through inheritance, he would become a new kind of emperor, an emperor of the ocean. He would use the wealth of the Indies to build a power base that would make Portugal so strong, so rich, so indispensable, that the thrones of Europe would have to reckon with him. He transformed his personal grief into a relentless, state-driven project of global expansion. The death of his wife and son had not broken him. It had unshackled him. His ambition, once focused narrowly on Spain, now exploded outwards across the oceans to encompass the entire globe. The age of discovery had truly begun, not as an act of enlightened exploration, but as a violent reaction to a broken heart and a dead child. What followed was not an age of peaceful trade, but one of brutal, systematic conquest. The return of Vasco da Gama did not open a dialogue between civilizations. It kicked down the door. Manuel, now driven by his new global ambition, understood that the Arab and Indian merchants of the Indian Ocean would not simply surrender their centuries-old trade networks. The Venetians and Mamluks would not stand idly by while their monopoly was destroyed. To build his new empire, he would have to create it with cannon fire. He began dispatching enormous fleets, the annual Armadas da India, not merely to trade, but to dominate. This was the birth of the Estado da India, the State of India, a new and terrifying kind of empire. It was not a territorial empire of vast landmasses, but a maritime empire, a chain of fortified cities and naval bases designed to control the key choke points of the ocean. Under the command of ruthless and brilliant viceroys like Francisco de Almeida and Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese fleets became a wave of unstoppable destruction. The sensory assault they unleashed on the unprepared cities of the Indian Ocean was horrific. Imagine the scene at the storming of Goa in 1510. The thunder of hundreds of bronze cannons, a sound louder and more terrifying than anything the defenders had ever heard, shattering stone walls and wooden ships. The acrid smell of gunpowder, a sulphurous fog that choked the air and burned the eyes. The sight of heavily armored Portuguese soldiers, like demons from another world, wading ashore, their steel swords and pikes cutting through lightly armed defenders. Albuquerque's orders were simple and brutal. Kill every Muslim, man, woman, or child. The water in the harbor turned red. Similar scenes were repeated across the ocean. At the Battle of Diu in 1509, a combined Mamluk-Gujarati fleet was annihilated, securing Portuguese naval supremacy for a century. At the capture of Malacca in 1511, a key hub in the Spice Islands trade, Albuquerque's men fought their way through the streets of one of the world's richest cities, leaving a trail of devastation. This was Manuel's vision made real, a network of fortresses, in Hormuz controlling the Persian Gulf, in Goa on the Indian coast, in Malacca controlling the Indonesian archipelago. That acted like a series of gates, forcing the entire trade of the East to flow into the hulls of his ships, all directed back to Lisbon. It was an empire built on superior firepower, breathtaking audacity, and a level of calculated violence that the old world of the Indian Ocean had never before witnessed. Back in Lisbon, Manuel ruled over this burgeoning global enterprise not like a medieval king, but like the CEO of a vast multinational corporation. History remembers him as O Venturoso, the Fortunate, but his contemporaries in the royal courts of Europe gave him another, more revealing nickname, the Grosser King. And in many ways, that is what he had become. He would stand in the newly constructed Ribera Palace, a magnificent building on the banks of the Tagus designed to impress visiting dignitaries and to process the immense wealth pouring in from the east. The sensory experience within its walls was a microcosm of his new world. The air was thick with exotic smells, the sharp, pungent aroma of black pepper, the sweet, warm scent of cinnamon, the medicinal fragrance of cloves, spices that had once been worth more than their weight in gold and were now arriving by the ton. Caged parrots and monkeys from Brazil and Africa screeched in the courtyards, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray stone of Europe. The king himself would be dressed in the finest silks and brocades, his fingers heavy with rings set with diamonds from Golconda and rubies from Ceylon. This was the moment of his ultimate hubris. He would sit in his counting house, the Casa de India, poring over ledgers that detailed the profits from voyages to lands most Europeans still believed were the stuff of myth. He read letters from Afonso de Albuquerque that were not reports from a general, but strategic plans from a global manager, outlining how to corner the market on nutmeg or how to build a fortress to control the trade in Chinese porcelain. Manuel began to see himself as something more than a king. He was God's chosen merchant, the man selected by Providence to redirect the wealth of the world for the glory of Christendom. He adopted the grandiose title Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. It was a declaration that he did not just rule a kingdom, he owned the global trade routes. The armillary sphere, an astronomical instrument symbolizing the heavens and the newly discovered seas, became his personal emblem, carved onto every building, every coin, every cannon. It was a symbol of his belief that he had mastered the globe, that he, Manuel, was the center of this new world he had created. While Manuel fashioned himself a global emperor, he still had to navigate the treacherous politics of his own backyard, and his primary rival remained his own father-in-law, Ferdinand of Aragon. The relationship between these two men was a masterpiece of diplomatic hypocrisy, a chess match played over decades with kingdoms as the pieces. Ferdinand, the old fox of European politics, was one of the models for Machiavelli's The Prince. He was cynical, pragmatic, and utterly ruthless, a man who saw treaties as temporary conveniences and marriage as just another tool of statecraft. He looked at his son-in-law, the grosser king, with a mixture of awe and contempt. He was impressed by the staggering wealth Manuel was extracting from the East, but he saw the entire enterprise as a reckless, nouveau riche gamble. Ferdinand's ambitions were continental. He was focused on Italy, on containing France, on consolidating his power in Spain. Manuel's global crusade struck him as dangerously overextended, a distraction from the real centers of power. Their personal drama was a constant undercurrent. After the death of his first wife, Isabella of Aragon, Manuel, in a desperate bid to keep the Iberian dream alive, married her younger sister, Maria. This made him Ferdinand's son-in-law twice over, binding the two courts in an intimate but deeply distrustful embrace. They exchanged elaborate gifts. Manuel sent Ferdinand exotic animals from India. Ferdinand sent Manuel warnings about French intentions. They feigned friendship in their letters, addressing each other as beloved brother, while simultaneously plotting to undermine each other's influence. Ferdinand secretly worried that Portugal's new wealth would make it too powerful, a true rival rather than a junior partner on the peninsula. Manuel knew that Ferdinand would never willingly allow a Portuguese king to inherit the Spanish throne and was constantly working to ensure his own dynasty's succession. It was a relationship built on a shared goal, the defense of Christendom, but poisoned by a fundamental conflict of interest. Each man wanted to be the senior partner in the Iberian alliance, the true leader of the Christian world. This sworn enmity, disguised as a family bond, shaped the politics of the peninsula for 20 years. A quiet, personal war fought with marriage contracts and diplomatic envoys, while Manuel's cannons were reshaping the world thousands of miles away. An empire that spans the globe cannot be run on ambition alone. It requires a sophisticated machinery of state. While his viceroys were conquering the East, Manuel was engaged in an equally important, if less dramatic, project at home. The construction of a modern, centralized state capable of managing a global enterprise. His greatest achievement in this realm was the creation of the Casa da India, the House of India. This was far more than a simple trading company. It was the nerve center of the Portuguese Empire. Located in the heart of Lisbon, it was a combination of a treasury, a customs house, a naval arsenal, a school of navigation, and an intelligence agency. All ships sailing to or from the east were required by law to register their cargo at the Casa. Its army of clerks and accountants tracked every peppercorn, every bolt of silk, every chest of gold that entered the kingdom. Its cartographers incorporated the latest discoveries from returning pilots into the great secret map, the Padrón Real, which was guarded like a state secret. The Casa set the prices for spices across Europe, making it the world's first truly global commodity exchange. It was the bureaucratic engine that turned the raw violence of conquest into cold, hard cash for the royal treasury. At the same time, Manuel undertook a monumental legal reform, commissioning a group of jurists to collect and systematize the kingdom's chaotic medieval laws. The result was the Ordenações Manuelinas, the first unified legal code in Portuguese history. It was a key step in strengthening the power of the central monarchy over the feudal nobles, and the vast wealth generated by the Casa da India financed a cultural explosion, the flourishing of a unique artistic style that would bear the king's name, Manueline. This was the architecture of the Age of Discovery made stone. In buildings like the Jeronimos Monastery or the Tower of Belém, late Gothic structures were festooned with an incredible riot of maritime symbolism. Stone columns were carved to look like coiled sea ropes. Doorways were framed with intricate coral and seaweed. And everywhere, Manuel's personal emblem, the armillary sphere, was proudly displayed. The Manueline style was a triumphant, almost boastful declaration of the nation's new identity. It was the physical embodiment of the grosser king's triumph, a permanent monument to an age when a small kingdom on the edge of Europe suddenly and violently found itself at the center of the world. Amidst the grand projects of empire building and legal reform, the king's personal life remained a sphere of cold, political calculation. Manuel's second and third marriages were not affairs of the heart, but strategic moves in his unending pursuit of the Iberian dream. After the death of his first wife, Isabella, he had married her younger sister, Maria of Aragon. This was a purely political match, designed to produce the heir that his first marriage had denied him. Maria was a quiet, fertile queen who dutifully produced 10 children, including the future King John III. She provided the stability and the heirs that the kingdom required, but the marriage lacked the grand, quasi-messianic purpose of his first union. It kept the dynastic links to Spain alive, but it did not bring him any closer to the Spanish throne itself, as Maria was not the eldest daughter. The court Manuel presided over with Queen Maria was one of the most brilliant in Europe, a glittering stage for the display of imperial wealth. The king was a master of propaganda, using lavish festivals, tournaments, and even a famous embassy to the Pope, which included an elephant from India as a gift, to advertise Portugal's newfound power. This was the context of his life, a public spectacle of unparalleled magnificence, funded by the profits of the spice trade, all while his private life was dictated by dynastic necessity. When Queen Maria died in 1517, the aging Manuel, now almost 50, married for a third time. His choice was Eleanor of Austria, the sister of the man who was now his greatest rival, the young King Charles of Spain, soon to be Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This marriage was a final, defensive move in the Great Game. He was trying to secure an alliance with the new, rising power in Europe, a power that was rapidly eclipsing his own. His family life, with his huge brood of children from Maria and his new young wife, was a reflection of his political journey. It began with a passionate, all-consuming obsession for one woman and the crown she represented, evolved into a practical, dynastic partnership to secure his own kingdom, and ended with a pragmatic alliance to protect his legacy against a new generation of more powerful rulers. The onions and vegetables of his family life were never separate from the meat of his imperial project. They were the very roots from which it grew. But beneath the glittering surface of Manuel's golden age, the poison he had injected into the kingdom for political gain began to rot the foundations of his society. The forced conversions of 1497 had not created a unified Catholic kingdom. They had created a large, resentful, and deeply distrusted population of new Christians, or conversos. These were the former Jews and their descendants, who were now nominally Christian, but were widely suspected of practicing their ancestral faith in secret. The old prejudices did not disappear with baptism. They festered, and in the spring of 1506, they erupted in one of the most horrific episodes of Manuel's reign. Lisbon was in the grip of a devastating plague and a prolonged drought. The populace, terrified and looking for a scapegoat, was whipped into a frenzy by radical Dominican friars who preached that the plague was God's punishment for the kingdom's laxity towards the secret heretics. The spark came during a mass at a monastery. When a believer claimed to have seen a miraculous light on a crucifix, a new Christian in the crowd made the mistake of suggesting it was merely a reflection. He was dragged outside by the enraged mob and beaten to death. This single act of violence unleashed a tidal wave of bloodlust. For 3 days, the city descended into a living hell. Mobs, led by friars and foreign sailors, rampaged through the new Christian quarters, dragging people from their homes. The sensory experience was one of pure barbarism. The streets echoed with the screams of the dying, the splintering of doors, the inhuman roar of the crowd. Men, women, and children were butchered in the streets, their bodies thrown onto massive bonfires in the city squares. The smell of burning flesh hung over Lisbon. By the time the king's troops, who were outside the city, managed to restore order, as many as 4,000 people had been slaughtered. Manuel was horrified, not out of any great love for the new Christians, but because it was a breakdown of the royal authority on which his power depended. He punished the ringleaders with brutal efficiency. The friars were defrocked and burned at the stake. But the Lisbon massacre was a terrifying harbinger of the storm to come. It revealed the deep social and religious sickness that his cynical policy had created. It was the first great crack in the facade of his golden age, a terrifying glimpse of the fires of the Inquisition that his successors would unleash upon the kingdom. As his empire in the East flourished, Manuel became increasingly consumed by a fateful and ultimately disastrous obsession: the crusade in North Africa. This was an error in grand strategy born from a complex mix of genuine piety, personal pride, and intense rivalry with Spain. For centuries, the Iberian kingdoms had defined themselves through the reconquista, the holy war against the Muslims of the peninsula. Now that the reconquista was over, this crusading energy needed a new outlet, and the natural target was the coast of Morocco, the Maghreb. Manuel saw himself not just as a merchant king, but as a true crusader, the leader of Christendom's holy war. While the Estado de India was a stunningly profitable enterprise, it did not carry the same chivalric prestige as fighting the infidel on the battlefield. Furthermore, his great rival, Spain, was actively conquering territories in North Africa, capturing cities like Oran and Tripoli. Manuel felt a burning need to compete, to prove that he was as much a warrior for the faith as Ferdinand and Isabella. This pride, this need for crusading legitimacy, led him to make a critical strategic miscalculation. He began to pour vast resources, money, ships, and men that were desperately needed to consolidate his fragile empire in India into a series of costly and bloody campaigns to capture and hold a string of Moroccan coastal fortresses. These were not valuable trading posts like Goa or Malacca. They were military liabilities, sand-swept outposts surrounded by hostile territory, requiring constant, expensive reinforcement. The psychology behind this error was profound. Manuel was a king who had achieved unimaginable success through a new form of power, maritime commerce and naval technology. But in his heart, he still craved the validation of the old world, the glory of the medieval knight. The war in Morocco was an attempt to purchase that glory. It was a vanity project on a grand scale, a decision driven by his ego's desperate need to be seen not as the grosser king, but as a new Godfrey of Bouillon, the heir to the crusading heroes of old. This fateful act, this diversion of focus and resources from the profitable East to the barren sands of Africa, would lead directly to the greatest military catastrophe of his reign. The culmination of Manuel's misguided African obsession came in August of 1515. The king assembled a massive expeditionary force, one of the largest Portugal had ever put to sea, with the objective of capturing the strategic port of Marmora in Morocco. He poured the immense wealth of the spice trade into this venture, equipping an armada of over 200 ships and an army of some 20,000 men. It was to be his crowning achievement as a crusader king, a victory that would echo across Christendom and put his Spanish rivals in the shade. The expedition was a disaster from the very beginning. The fleet was battered by storms on its way to Africa. When the army finally disembarked, they were met with torrential rains that turned the coastal plain into an impassable swamp. The sensory experience of the Portuguese camp was one of utter misery. The soldiers were bogged down in knee-deep, stinking mud. Their gunpowder was soaked, rendering their firearms useless. Their armor rusted in the constant damp. Dysentery swept through the ranks, fueled by contaminated water and dwindling supplies. The air was thick with the stench of sickness and the buzz of insects. They were a modern, technologically advanced army, completely neutralized by the weather. The Moroccan Sultan, observing this, gathered a massive force and attacked. The Portuguese, stuck in the mud, were unable to form proper battle lines. The battle was not a clash of armies, it was a slaughter. The scene descended into chaos. The terrifying sound of thousands of Moroccan horsemen charging through the swamp, their war cries mixing with the screams of the Portuguese being cut down. Men, trapped by the weight of their own armor, drowned in the mud. The retreat to the ships became a panicked rout. By the time the shattered remnants of the Armada limped back to Lisbon, they had lost nearly half their army, as many as 10,000 men, and the bulk of their artillery and equipment. The catastrophe at Marmora was more than a military defeat. It was a profound humiliation. It shattered the carefully cultivated myth of Manuel's invincibility, the aura of the fortunate king whom God always favored. The vast treasure spent on the expedition was utterly wasted, a hole blown in the royal finances that even the spice trade could not easily fill. It was the greatest catastrophe of his reign, a brutal lesson that the world could not always be conquered by wealth and will alone, a bitter fruit grown from the seeds of his own pride. In the final years of Manuel's reign, the geopolitical chessboard shifted decisively against him, and the dream that had fueled his entire life was finally and irrevocably extinguished. The agent of this change was a single young man, Charles of Ghent. Born in 1500, Charles was a product of the intricate dynastic marriages of the age. He was the grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I on his father's side, and the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain on his mother's side. He was also, crucially, the nephew of Manuel's third wife, Eleanor. When Ferdinand of Aragon died in 1516, Charles inherited the crowns of Castile and Aragon, uniting Spain under a single ruler. A few years later, upon his grandfather's death, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor. In the space of a few years, one man had accumulated a collection of titles and territories that dwarfed anything seen in Europe for centuries. He was now Charles V, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, Naples, and the vast Spanish territories in the Americas. A new superpower had been born, and it completely encircled Manuel's continental ambitions. The old Iberian dream, the hope that a son of Manuel's might one day rule a united peninsula, was dead. Portugal, even with the wealth of the Indies, was now permanently relegated to the status of a junior power next to the Habsburg behemoth. Manuel, now an old man in his 50s, had to face the bitter reality of his own political eclipse. He saw the world he had helped to create, a world of global empires and European power politics, move beyond his control. His great project in India, once a source of limitless wealth, was now facing increasing resistance from the Ottomans and local rulers, and the cost of maintaining the empire was beginning to spiral. The fortunate king's luck seemed to be running out. He had outmaneuvered his rivals in Portugal. He had outsmarted the Venetians. He had conquered the Indian Ocean, but he could not outrun time and the inexorable logic of dynastic succession. The collapse was not a sudden event, but a slow, creeping realization that his historical moment was over. His last chance to secure a dominant place for his dynasty in Europe had vanished with the rise of Charles V, leaving him the ruler of a rich, but ultimately peripheral, kingdom. The end for the Grocer King came not on a battlefield in Africa or in a distant eastern fortress, but in his own opulent palace, a victim of the same mundane frailties that afflict all men. In early December of 1521, during a period of plague in Lisbon, King Manuel fell ill with a raging fever. He was 52 years old, his body likely weakened by a lifetime of relentless work and political stress. As he lay dying in his chambers in Ribera Palace, the world he had created surrounded him. The sensory atmosphere of his last moments was a testament to his life's work. The air in the room, meant to be purified by burning herbs, was still heavy with the exotic scent of cloves and cinnamon, spices from an empire he had conquered but would never see. Through the window, he could hear the faint sounds of the port he had built, the creaking of ships that were part of the great conveyor belt of wealth he had engineered. He knew he was dying. With the cold lucidity of the end, he put his affairs in order, confirming his son John as his heir and making provisions for his other children. In his final hours, he asked for a choir to sing for him, the sacred music a final comfort for a man who believed, despite all his ruthless pragmatism, in his own divine mission. His mind, drifting on the edge of delirium, must have been a sea of maps. Not the old, cramped maps of his youth, but the new, sprawling charts his own sailors had drawn. Charts that showed Africa circumnavigated, India reached, Brazil discovered, and the world bound together by the thin blue lines of Portuguese sea routes. He died on the 13th of December, a strangely quiet end for a man whose reign had been defined by the thunder of cannons and the crash of waves on uncharted shores. The circumstances were deeply ironic. The Lord of Conquest, the man who had unleashed so much violence upon the world, was conquered by a microbe. The man whose ambition had been to unite the crowns of Iberia died the king of a nation whose independence was now more precarious than ever, overshadowed by the giant of Habsburg Spain. His story, which began in the shadow of a brother's murder and rose to the heights of global power, came full circle, ending in the quiet, intimate finality of a fevered room. A powerful king surrendering to a force far greater than any earthly empire. The legacy Manuel left behind is a labyrinth of conflicting interpretations, a historical figure so monumental that he is claimed as both a hero and a villain, a visionary and a tyrant. To the Portuguese, especially in the nationalist narratives of later centuries, he is forever o venturoso, the fortunate, the king who presided over the nation's século de ouro, its golden age. He is the architect of their greatest glories, the man whose vision and will transformed a small kingdom into the master of a global empire. The magnificent Manueline monuments he left behind, the Geronimos Monastery, the Tower of Belém, are celebrated as national treasures, symbols of a time when Portugal was the center of the world. But to historians of empire, the picture is far darker. He is the pioneer of a new form of European colonialism, one based on maritime supremacy and brutal economic exploitation. The model of the fortified trading post, the use of superior firepower to force unequal terms of trade, the systematic violence of commanders like Albuquerque. This was the template for the next 400 years of European domination. He is not the enlightened patron of discovery, but the CEO of a global protection racket. For the descendants of the Sephardic Jews, his name is a curse. He is the king who, for the sake of a political marriage, betrayed a community that had served his nation for centuries, unleashing a wave of persecution that would culminate in the horrors of the Portuguese Inquisition. In their history, he is not Manuel the Fortunate, but Manuel the Persecutor, a man who traded his people's soul for a dynastic prize. And in the lands he discovered, the perspective is different still. In the histories of India, of Indonesia, of East Africa, his arrival marks the beginning of the end. He is the harbinger of a violent intrusion, the man whose ships brought not just new goods, but a new and terrible form of warfare that shattered ancient societies and trade networks. The conflict of interpretations is irresolvable because all are true. He was a nation builder and an empire builder, a patron of the arts and a religious persecutor, a visionary of globalization and the first great colonial oppressor. His legacy is as vast, as wealthy, and as stained with blood as the empire he created. And so, we return to the core question, to the central dramatic paradox of Manuel's life. How did one man's love for a woman change the map of the world? The final comprehensive answer is that his love for Isabella of Aragon was inseparable from his ambition for her throne. It was not the simple romantic passion of a poet, but the all-consuming, strategic obsession of a king who saw her as the key to a divine destiny. She was the vessel for his Iberian dream. This obsession, and the cold calculations of his future in-laws, Ferdinand and Isabella, created the crucible in which the age of discovery was forged. The first critical step was the price they demanded for the marriage, the expulsion or forced conversion of the Jews. This single act, a test of Manuel's Catholic credentials, had two world-altering consequences. First, it created a moral and financial vacuum in his kingdom, which put immense pressure on him to find a new, spectacular source of revenue to justify his actions and refill his coffers. The voyage to India ceased to be one option among many and became an absolute necessity. Second, it set a precedent for religious intolerance as a tool of state-building, a poison that would have long-term consequences. But the true catalyst was failure. The second critical step was the death of Isabella in childbirth, and later, the death of their infant son Miguel, the heir to all of Iberia. This catastrophic personal loss destroyed the original plan. The path to empire through the marriage bed was blocked forever. It was this failure that channeled Manuel's immense messianic ambition away from the claustrophobic politics of Europe and out into the limitless horizons of the ocean. The quest for India became the magnificent substitute for the lost crown of Spain. The wealth of the East would be the compensation for the throne he could not inherit. The title Lord of the Conquest of India would replace the coveted Emperor of Hispania. The age of discovery, therefore, was not the primary objective. It was the spectacular, world-changing Plan B, a consequence born directly from the wreckage of a failed political love affair. A united Iberia was the dream. A global empire was the consolation prize. Ultimately, the saga of Manuel the Fortunate is a profound lesson in the nature of history itself. It teaches us that the great, impersonal forces we read about in textbooks, economic trends, technological advancements, religious movements, are often driven and directed by the most intimate and unpredictable of human emotions. The story of this king is the ultimate refutation of a purely materialist or deterministic view of the past. It shows how the intensely personal desires of a single individual, magnified by the power of a throne, can become a geopolitical tsunami, reshaping continents and altering the destiny of millions. Manuel's life is a testament to the fact that history does not move in a straight, predictable line. It is a chaotic, swirling storm, whipped up by the unpredictable winds of human passion. A king's obsession with a woman and the crown she represents leads to an act of religious persecution. That act creates a financial imperative for a risky sea voyage. The success of that voyage, combined with the tragic failure of the original dynastic plan, unleashes a torrent of ambition that floods the entire globe. It is a chain reaction of cause and effect, where the initial spark is not a grand strategy, but a human heart, with all its vanities, its griefs, and its bottomless hunger for a legacy. The universal lesson of his life is about the terrifying and creative power of obsession, and about the way the grand tapestry of history is woven from the humble threads of personal hopes and private sorrows. A broken heart can launch 1,000 ships, and a spurned ambition can build an empire that the world had never imagined. The final frame is not of the king, but of his legacy, carved in enduring stone. We are in Lisbon, at the mouth of the Tagus River, where his great fleets once departed. We push in on the intricate stonework of the Jeronimos Monastery, the great monument he commissioned as a tribute to Vasco da Gama's voyage, a tomb for the kings of the Golden Age. The camera glides over the surfaces, revealing the riotous detail of the Manueline style. It is a style that speaks of a world turned inside out. We see stone columns carved into thick, coiled maritime ropes, as if the very architecture of the church is moored to some distant, unseen shore. We see arches dripping with sculpted seaweed and coral, the imagery of the ocean floor brought into a sacred space. And then the camera finds it, repeated over and over again, the king's personal emblem, his signature on history, the armillary sphere. It is a complex, beautiful object of interlocking rings, a scientific instrument used to model the heavens, a symbol of the new science of navigation that made his empire possible. But here, it is not just a scientific symbol. It is intertwined with the cross, with the ropes, with the coral. It represents a world made whole, a globe finally encircled and understood, a planet captured in a web of knowledge and sea lanes. This stone sphere is the perfect metaphor for Manuel's achievement. It is a symbol of enlightenment and discovery, but also of control and possession. It is a beautiful, intricate cage, a model of a new global system with Lisbon at its center, a system built to enrich one nation at the expense of many. It is the delicious, intoxicating fruit of an empire, a testament to a golden age born from a brutal choice, a cynical bargain, and a shattered dream. The shadow of this sphere, both a tool of knowledge and a manacle of empire, would stretch across the next 5 centuries of human history.